Quilts of Gee's Bend, Alabama. Women in American history were placed in the shadows with very little rights. The women of Gee's Bend had made quilts for their families to keep warm during the harsh winter nights of their homes. Since most of their housing was without heat, the quilts were essential for survival of the sharecroppers and their families. For almost a century now, these quilts have shown symbolic value for the struggles that African Americans, both on and off the plantation, faced for generations. Each quilt was handmade with love for their community. The appreciation for the art of quilt making was passed down from their mothers and grandmothers. Located just outside of Selma, the small town of Gee's Bend is home to nearly 700 inhabitants. In the 1930s, Gee's Bend saw a significant shift in their community as a merchant of the Bend died and the family of this merchant collected on debts owed to him in a brutal way. Much of the land of this area was sold to organizations who set up Gee's Bend farms to help sustain the inhabitants of the area. Although many people fled after the Great Depression made its mark on American lives, many also stayed in Gee's Bend. From the 1960s onward, the community of the Gee's Bend created attention for the production of their quilts. Much of the tradition kept within the quilts relates back to the 19th century, where slavery was a big part of African American lives. African culture was also a big contribute to the patterns and culture of the groups as well. Women would also construct these quilts from old pieces of scrap materials from plantation uniforms to make bed covers. Throughout the post-bellum years and into the 20th century, Gee's Bend women made quilts to keep themselves and their children warm in unheated shacks that lacked running water, telephones, and electricity. The women who created these quilts had features in many places around the country. The Museum of Fine Arts, located in Alabama, became closed due to an unexpected occurrence that shut out further viewings of the exhibit. The museum, located 2 hours away from Gee's Bend, reopened its full coverage, but there was no feature of the quilts of Gee's Bend. The women fought for justice to have their works featured in the exhibit once again, and eventually got a spot for their quilts in the contemporary setting. After pleading for justice, their quilts were not only featured in the Alabama Museum of Fine Arts, but in other locations around the country. The fight that the women had to put up accurately displays the time period for the peak of their success. As the quilts of Gee's Bend became more publicized, many other artists wanted to show their praise for the women who created them. Some American artists told stories through quilts as well. Their emphasis in much of their works was shown through the value and power of women, which relates back to the honoring of women of Gee's Bend. The quilts were very important in the homes of their families of each quilt maker. While they saw their valuable purpose, many outsiders did not seem to notice how essential these quilts were in the survival of the residents of Gee's Bend. Some blamed the lack of publicizing on misunderstanding the concept, but many simply did not care to learn about the meaning behind each quilt because the artists were African American. These artists understand the reality of how the quilts were not put into museums, but instead emphasized their importance of community values, which is found among all of the quilt members and artists in Gee's Bend. The quilts of Gee's Bend demonstrate the genius of a group of exceptionally talented women of the 1920s who created particular works of art for their families in their Gee's Bend, Alabama homes. Originating from a small, rural, Black community, the women of Gee's Bend constructed over hundreds of quilt masterpieces from the 1920s and continue to create quilts today. Artists of Gee's Bend are the inhabitants of a tradition that refers back to many generations. Though early examples of their community's quilts have been lost over time, these handmade creations represent a portion of the tradition of African American quilt making in themselves, relating their works to their personal lives as well.